All right. So, lesson one, the prelude to war. What we have here is the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. 5 years after the first domino falls to get World War I going, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand at the hands of the Black Hand and one of their members, Gavrilo Princip. So this is signed June 28, 1919, just 14 miles outside of Paris. And this is really the beginning, or the first domino set up that will lead to the Second World War. Yeah.
Wasn't the assassination of the Duke the most messed up assassination that happened?
Yeah, so
someone tried to drown himself, and there was like cyanide pills that were expired.
Well, yeah,
like 6 people.
he failed the first time. He failed in the first attempt, and then he just kind of got lucky because the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn and came down the alley right to him, and he wound up getting the job done. Yeah, it was a mess the way that went down. So the political end of World War II or World War I leads to the basic causes of World War II. So nationalistic tensions, unresolved issues following World War I, the result of the Versailles Treaty, resentment resulting from World War I in the interwar period, obviously different ideologies and philosophies, and Michelle hit on a lot of that earlier in the discussion leading up to the lesson. The global impact of the Great Depression. We consider the Great Depression to be very, very rough for the United States, with unemployment at its worst at about 25%, and among African Americans and minorities at 50%. But it was even worse globally in Europe and other parts of the World War I war-torn nations. We have problems with appeasement, militarism and racism, and ultimately genocide that are major causes here. Military aggression that will be led by the Nazis, the fascists in Italy, and the Imperial Japanese Army. World War II starts after aggressive actions were met with official declarations of war and armed resistance. So we can look at the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 through to the invasion of China in 1937. We'll talk more about why Manchuria is invaded, talk about the rape of Nanking, and we'll talk about how the United States responds to the Japanese invasion. A couple of books that I was going to recommend to you guys last time. One book is The Rape of Nanking. It's a gripping and tragic book about the invasion of the Japanese invasion of Nanking. Another book that I was going to encourage you guys to take a look at is a book called The China Mirage. It's written by the same author that wrote Flags of Our Fathers. And it just talks about American and Asian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Filipino relations leading all the way up to World War II. So those are a couple of titles you guys could look into. And then obviously the Nazi invasion of Poland and the Non-Aggression Pact of the Soviet Union in 1939 that leads to declaration of war by Great Britain and France. So let's take a look at some of the results of the Versailles Treaty that send us in this direction. The German army was reduced to 100,000 men. Air Force was dismantled. The Navy was sort of downsized. Really, at the end of this war, the German military was a shell of its former self. Reduction of German territory by as much as 15%. Germany was ordered to surrender colonies overseas. That has a connection to us. Do you all remember the American-German colony that was shared? It's a good guess. It's actually in the Pacific. Samoa. Yeah. Yeah. It was split in two. Another interesting colony close to Liberia that they had to give up claims to is Anchor Pequena. Any idea why Anchor Pequena would create problems? What's that? It's a colony in Africa that they had to give up their claims to.
Oh, I remember.
It's actually a cause of World War I, and it's connected as a cause for World War II. There are two resources that you're on the right track. Diamonds and bat guano. Why would bat guano be important?
It makes gunpowder.
Yes, very good. Excellent. So, the payment of reparations. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. The loss of the Alsace-Lorraine region, where I think Robin's people are from. That's the French-German border. The demilitarization and sort of what we would call a DMZ area, where many of my people are from, my ancestors, is the Rhine Valley. The payment of reparations, somewhere to the tune of about $6.6 billion. Recognizing new nation states like Austria and Poland. The inability to reunite with Austria. Temporary loss of coal mines, not gold, but coal mines, to France. The occupation of the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland and all German colonies. And then Germany is ordered to restore all property to French institutions and individuals. You're good. So this is a really detailed breakdown. Did we get this detailed about the treaty last year? I don't think we did. I think we talked about reparations and loss of land. So on the top right, we have the leaders of the Versailles Treaty jamming the peace terms down Germany's throat. And it's kind of hard to see the guy on the end there. You can see it on your lesson. Can you recognize who that is? Who's at the end of the spoon there? The one with the mouth open is Germany. And the members are Lloyd George, Clemenceau. But who's on the very end holding the end of the spoon? You can't see it up there. Can you see it on your... It's Woodrow Wilson. Yeah. And then another political cartoon I wanted to share, and the Versailles Treaty, and climbing out of the treaty, it says Hitler Party. This I added, and I wanted to use this as an important symbol because we're going to see it again. This is the rail car that the French and the Germans and the British determined the armistice of November 11th, the ceasefire, the end of the war, the reason that we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th. Well, the surrender of Germany is signed in that rail car. We're going to see this rail car again. Hitler is going to get this very rail car and forced the French to sign their surrender in the same rail car at the start of World War II.
And you think he had a little bit of a grudge there?
A little bit of an axe to grind. I got a handy dandy map for you that connects to the Versailles Agreement. And I don't need to go through every single thing, but we've got recognition of Poland, recognition of Czechoslovakia, recognition of Austria, the coal fields, the demilitarized area of the Rhineland. This is the Alsace-Lorraine region. We're going to be talking about a defensive line that's built in this area that is going to be a really important story moving into the war. We also, another thing that I wanted to point out, Germany's lost her colonies, and it's also the beginning of the Weimar Republic in Germany. And then obviously financial ruin with not only the reparations, but what happens with the German mark? Yeah, it just collapses. Why?
They were in an economic depression.
Yeah.
They had to pay back so much money for World War I.
Yeah, I mean, you know the reparations weren't paid off until after the 21st century.
Wasn't it 2011?
Yeah, very good. So you've got you got a depressionary era that Germany's going through, the reparations, the country's devastated. You've got overprinting of the mark. So there's these pictures that I've got for you in the next lesson where the kids in Germany are just playing with stacks of money like they're building blocks. That's how devastated the country was financially. There was nothing to back their money. They lost commodities. They didn't have the specie. You could run a parallel to sort of like the war-torn South after the American Civil War, which we've just dealt with. It's like war-torn Germany after the war. And there's something that's important to note here. Does America or do other countries try to intervene and provide aid after World War I? And the answer is yes. But to who or whom? Not the aggressors, right? Countries like Holland got American aid. In fact, that's where Herbert Hoover really got politically connected. He was sort of the hero of Holland because he provided this large aid program to help feed the people of the Netherlands after World War I. Germany did not have that situation going on for it. There was very little aid going to them. So when we think about aid programs, and I'm getting way ahead of myself, which is fine, because I'm just going to do that from time to time. Clearly you've already seen me do that. There is no Marshall Plan after World War I. That is why George C. Marshall issued the Marshall Plan after World War II to say, hey, we should learn from our mistakes historically and not let World War III happen by not providing aid to our enemies. Now, obviously, the Marshall Plan, a brilliant piece of American foreign policy, was advantageous for the United States because it provided aid, it provided allies, it promoted republics, and it promoted capitalism, right? But again, the countries that were on the losing side, they weren't getting the aid that they really necessarily needed. So that sort of punitive measure of what happens with Germany is really going to set the stage. And yes, economic depression, which a lot of you guys pointed out, and the lack of food and the lack of supply and necessities to survive, The Germans don't have that, but also that loss of dignity is a big problem in this post-war era. So some of the breakdown of the causes continued. Germany's defeated. Italy is disappointed and in financial ruin. Japan, very ambitious, anxious to regain control of much of the Pacific and gain much needed resources in the Pacific. That's really what's behind the invasion of Manchuria, China, and islands throughout the Pacific. They wanted their Pacific predominance to be accepted globally. Another thing that we need to understand too is that there is a pretty serious level of racism that Japan has to deal with in terms of the Versailles Treaty and in terms of entering the League of Nations. They're kind of left out of the negotiating at Versailles. It's really dominated by England, France, and the United States. Italy has a seat at the table. Japan has a seat at the table. But Japan's not really, they're kind of pushed out of any negotiations, and they're really pushed out of any planning for the formation of the League of Nations. So we're going to learn here soon, Japan will be one of the first large-scale major countries to leave the League in the 1930s. So all three of these countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, see themselves as champions against communism. As we already know, and we're going to highlight this moving forward in this lesson, as World War I is raging, the Bolshevik Revolution has occurred. The rise of Lenin, the rise of Trotsky and Stalin, and ultimately, by the end of this, the Russians are going to be communists, and they too are left out of the equation at Versailles. They're left out of the equation in the League, and they are pretty offended by the fact that their Bolshevik Revolution was one of the main causes that pulled America into World War I. So obviously, the League of Nations is Woodrow Wilson's baby. His plan to have World War I be the war that ends all wars. But the irony of all this is that we don't even join it. We're like I've got a political cartoon I'm going to share with you. We're like the missing keystone. Our involvement in the success of the League is essential. And we don't end up joining, and we're going to talk about why that happens. Another problem, too, is that the World Disarmament Conference that occurred in Geneva, Switzerland in the early 1930s, that leads to nations leaving the League. Germany will ultimately be allowed to join. They'll leave. Japan will leave. Soviets, they're gonna step away. So it's like Italy will exit. All these, tragically, these attempts to provide world peace, it all just falls apart. So this is the World Disarmament Conference in Geneva. They met for the first time in 1932, 33, and 34. So we look at the rise of nationalism. Obviously, the belief that one's nation is superior to another. And these extremes can create conflicts between nations. And what Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan's military leader, Hideki Tojo, the Emperor Hirohito, was in control, but truly this era of militarism, the standard was set when the invasion of Manchuria occurs in 1931, and the Japanese government and the Japanese emperor didn't issue the invasion and the destruction of the railroad into Manchuria and the occupation of Manchuria, and they did nothing to stop it. Nor did they do anything to stop the invasion of China, the invasion of Nanking. So it was pretty clear by 1937 that it was not the emperor or the government that was in charge, it was the military leadership of the Japanese Imperial Army. So here we have the Nazi swastika, the Nazi flag. On the left we have the fascist logo, the bundle of iron rods around the axe, and then the symbol of fascis, and then on the right the Japanese flag, the rising sun. And that is another interesting book for you to check out if you're really interested in Pearl Harbor. There is a really great book called At Dawn We Slept that you might want to add to your list of possible reads. So this is kind of where I'm going to pump the brakes today, the failure of the League of Nations. So not all countries joined the League. The idea was to prevent future wars. And Wilson brings the treaty back. You keep in mind, this is the first time an American president has gone globally to negotiate a foreign treaty in American history. And when he comes back, the Congress is controlled by the Republican Party, and the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is Henry Cabot Lodge, who is one of Wilson's rivals. It was the goal of Henry Cabot Lodge and the majority of the Republicans in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to turn down not only the Treaty of Versailles and its measures, but also agree not to join the League of Nations because America was, the mood had changed. In the post-Civil War era, all the way up to World War I, that was an era of American imperialism. Now this is going to be the beginning of an era of American isolationism. What Republicans and Warren G. Harding will call a return to normalcy. They don't want to get involved in European affairs. They start using the rhetoric of what document or doctrine? Yeah, Monroe. Yeah, saying we need to stay out of European affairs. Honestly, you could make a case for both groups because I'm not here to vilify Henry Cabot Lodge or the Republican Party in this era. Nor am I trying to make Woodrow Wilson, some American hero. This is just how this went down. And legitimately, the Treaty of Versailles killed Woodrow Wilson. The League of Nations killed the guy. He went on a cross-country whistle-stop tour to promote the treaty and to promote the League of Nations in like a public referendum. He ends up having a debilitating stroke, and he's not able to follow through with any of his duties as president for the remainder of his term. In fact, if we really want to find the first female president of the United States, Edith Wilson carried the White House through the remainder of Wilson's presidency. She made a significant amount of really important decisions following his stroke, and not long after he leaves office, he's going to pass away. And if that's actually a really easy presidential library for you guys to visit if you're ever interested. Woodrow Wilson's presidential library, you know where it is? Stanton, Virginia. Yeah, so right down the road. He was born and raised in Stanton. So really the League of Nations doesn't have a lot of power. It really lost its clout by not having the United States join. So there's sort of a bigger problem here is that the League loses even more power as globally this economic repression sets in and the entire world is suffering, clearly the United States is not all that interested in getting involved, nor that interested in providing large-scale aid, especially since we can't feed our own, we can't employ our own. The United Nations didn't have any military force. There was no standing army. There was nobody, and that's going to be, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's going to be a big difference for what will become the United Nations after World War II. And we could criticize the United Nations military capability, but there have been multiple United Nations military measures that have prevented some possible large-scale problems, i.e. the Korean War is a United Nations joint military action. And then really the UN's really not able to act very quickly. Membership dwindled, and they really couldn't stop any acts of aggression. They just didn't have the membership, they didn't have the military force. And this is where we'll stop for today. This is a political cartoon of the League of Nations. This League of Nations bridge was designed by the President of the United States, and it shows Uncle Sam resting his head on the keystone, a gap in the bridge.